Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Decline and Rise of Democracy, A Global History from Antiquity to Today, by David Stastavage, narrated by Tom Perkins. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to figures included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Preface. Where does democracy come from? How is it sustained, and what is its future? These are questions that have a special salience today in our current age of democratic anxiety. The United States has long been heralded as a successful democratic experiment and a lesson for others. If people once thought that republics had to be small to survive, the American experience seemed to have shown otherwise. In more recent decades, as the practice of selecting leaders in free elections spread around the globe, democracy acquired an aura of inevitability, as if it was the wave of the future, at least for those who would listen. Today, some fear that all of these conclusions were far too optimistic. Democracy itself may be less durable than they once thought, and even when it does survive, it may be captured by the few at the expense of the many. To understand where we are today and where we might be headed, we need to broaden our view to look at the deep history of democracy, and that is what I will propose we do in this book. I have been researching and writing on this subject for 20 years, particularly by working on the long evolution of representative institutions in Europe. In recent years, I began to think more explicitly about comparing world regions. Why, I asked, has Europe followed a fundamentally different political trajectory from China or the Middle East? While many scholars have written about the economic divergence that saw Europe become the first region to industrialize, fewer people have tried to explain the great political divergence. That will be one important goal of this book, and in pursuing it we will need to consider not only democracy, but also the logic of autocracy, the opposite form of governance. As we consider a broad range of human societies, it will turn out that events in out-of-the-way places and at distant times can sometimes tell us surprising things about our own political institutions of today. Democracy often thrived in places where we would least expect it. As part of this, we will learn that the story of democracy has not only been one of great thinkers writing great books, it has also been constructed by ordinary people working pragmatically to govern themselves in a collective fashion. Finally, as we consider in this book how our own contemporary democracies have evolved, we will have a better sense of their potential points of both strength and weakness. The particular institutions that we use to govern ourselves today are, to a great extent, the result of a long development of Anglo-American practices that was as much the product of circumstance as any natural evolution. The democracy we have today is but one potential way of organizing things. And in closing, I will suggest that once we recognize this, we will be in a better position to consider how it might evolve in the future. Part 1. Early Democracy. 1. Origins of Democratic Rule. We are taught that Europeans invented democracy. We learn that it was invented by the Greeks, who gave us the word itself, and we hear also that democracy in Greece died out after about as much time as the American Republic has existed. Democracy then gradually re-emerged in Europe during a long evolution, beginning with events like Magna Carta and the rise of Italian city republics. It culminated in the establishment of political systems based on competitive elections and universal suffrage. The practice of democracy eventually spread to other continents. One problem with this story is that when Europeans began conquering peoples on other continents, they sometimes found that local people had political institutions that were more democratic than what they knew in their home countries. In North America, as French Jesuit missionaries entered the territory of the people they called the Huron, they discovered a political system based on both central and local councils with broad participation, including for women. In the year 1636, one missionary commented that the Huron Central Council was like the Estates General of the country. His home country of France also had an Estates General, but it had not met for over 20 years, and it would not meet again until 1789. In Mesoamerica, Spanish conquerors more commonly encountered societies with hierarchical political systems, but not always. In 1519, as Hernán Cortés entered the territory of Tlaxcala, he observed that as far as he could judge the form of government was almost like that of Venice or Genoa or Pisa, because there is no one supreme ruler. His home country of Spain had such a single supreme ruler, King Charles I. The examples of the Huron and of Tlaxcala are not isolated exceptions. Throughout human history, many societies on multiple continents have independently developed political systems in which those who rule have been obliged to seek consent from those they govern. If we see seeking consent as a basic ingredient of democracy, then we can say that democracy itself occurs naturally among humans, even if it is far from inevitable. The question then becomes when and why democratic practices survive and prosper, and why this happened even in places where people had not read Aristotle. The other question we need to ask is, if early forms of democracy existed in many regions, then why did modern democracy, the selection of representatives through universal suffrage, emerge first in Europe and the United States? The answer, I will argue, has to do with the particular trajectory taken by Europe when compared with regions such as China and the Middle East. Ironically, it was Europe's backwardness that laid the ground for the rise of modern democracy. Early democracy and modern democracy. In its original sense, as used by the Greeks, the word democracy simply means that the people govern, or more literally, that the people have power. Each citizen participates, and the people, as a collective, rule. In the middle of the 20th century, one scholar described the indigenous societies of southern Africa as having a peculiar type of democracy. Free election of leaders was unknown, but tribal chiefs had to rule collectively with assemblies and councils that constrained their actions. The people, or a subset of them, participated in governance. Rather than calling this system peculiar, I will call it early democracy. This term is useful because early democracy differed from the modern form of democracy that we are familiar with today. Early democracy existed in lieu of a state bureaucracy. It was a system in which a ruler governed jointly with a council or assembly composed of members of society who were themselves independent from the ruler and not subject to his or her whim. They provided information while also assisting with governance. In some early democracies, rulers were selected by a council. In others, heredity played the primary role. Some councils in early democracies involved broad participation by the community, but it was on other occasions a more elite gathering. For those who had the right, participation took a deep and frequent form. Early democracy was so common in all regions of the globe that we should see it as a naturally occurring condition in human societies. I am not the first person to say something like this, but I will try to provide a new and more comprehensive view of this idea while also showing when and why early democracy prevailed. Athens, as well as many other democracies in ancient Greece, presents us with the most extensive example of early democracy. But there have been many other societies elsewhere in which early democracy was also the order of the day. This was true even if participation was not as extensive as in Athens. Examples of early democracy include those among the Huron and in Tlaxcala, to which I have already referred. We will also see examples from ancient Mesopotamia, pre-colonial Central Africa, ancient India, and elsewhere. Modern democracy differs from early democracy in several important ways. It is a political system in which representatives are chosen in competitive elections under universal suffrage. With universal adult suffrage, political participation is very broad. But in modern democracy, popular participation in governance is also more episodic than in early democracy. Representatives meet frequently to engage in governance, but the broader populace does not participate directly apart from at election time. Episodic participation is the first fracture point of modern democracy because it can produce citizen distrust and disengagement. There must be continual efforts to overcome this problem. The second fracture point of modern democracy is that it coexists with a state bureaucracy that manages day-to-day affairs, and the risk of this is that the people may no longer believe that they themselves are governing. This will be less likely to occur if democratic practices emerge before the creation of a state bureaucracy. Then, rulers and the people can build a bureaucracy jointly. But if bureaucracy comes first, this is less likely to happen, and this means that bureaucracy can either substitute for or complement modern democracy. It all depends on the sequence of events. If early democracy arose independently in many human societies, modern democracy is a more specifically European invention. Early democracy was a form of rule that proved durable over thousands of years. Modern democracy is something much more recent, and we should think of it as an ongoing experiment. To understand when and why this experiment will succeed, we need to first consider how both early and modern democracy emerged. Origins of early democracy. Early democracy emerged when rulers needed consent and cooperation from their people because they could not govern on their own. People had the opportunity to voice their consent or opposition in some form of an assembly or council. All rulers, both democratic and autocratic, need at least tacit consent from their people by not revolting. But consent in early democracy was not tacit, it was active. In early democracy, even if a council of the governed had no formal prerogative to veto decisions taken by a ruler, it could still exercise power if its members possessed information that a ruler did not. Three underlying factors helped lead to early democracy. It was first of all more prevalent in small-scale settings. We see this whether we speak of polities in Europe, in pre-colonial Africa, or in North America prior to European conquest. Small scale made it possible for members of a society to regularly attend the councils and assemblies that were the lifeblood of early democracy. In some early democracies, having a system of representation helped confront this problem of scale. Instead of having all attend, choose one person. But individual representatives still needed to travel to an assembly, and constituents still needed to monitor them once they were there. And when people were spread over a large area, this was more difficult. Representation was an adaptation to the problem of scale, but it did not solve it. The second factor that led to early democracy was when rulers lacked knowledge of what people were producing. This gave them an incentive to share power to better know what sort of taxes they could levy. We should think of taxation in broad terms here. The problem was faced by any ruler who sought to appropriate or redistribute economic resources. Features of the natural environment sometimes drove uncertainty, as they made agricultural production harder to predict. In other cases, rulers faced uncertainty because they lacked a state bureaucracy that could measure and assess production. Throughout history, uncertainty of this sort has been a great problem in taxation for rulers. Form an overly pessimistic judgment of how much you can tax, and you will be foregoing potential revenue. Form an overly optimistic judgment of how much you can tax, and you risk provoking either a revolt or an exit of your population. The third factor that led to early democracy involved the balance between how much rulers needed their people and how much people could do without their rulers. When rulers had a greater need for revenue, they were more likely to accept governing in a collaborative fashion. and this was even more likely if they needed people to fight wars. With inadequate means of simply compelling people to fight, rulers offered them political rights. The flip side of all this was that whenever the populace found it easier to do without a particular ruler, say by moving to a new location, then rulers felt compelled to govern more consensually. The idea that exit options influence hierarchy is, in fact, so general it also applies to species other than humans. Among species as diverse as ants, birds, and wasps, social organization tends to be less hierarchical when the costs of what biologists call dispersal are low. Over time, early democracy persisted in some societies, but it died out in many others. It did so as societies grew in scale. It also did so as rulers acquired new ways of monitoring production. It did so, finally, when people found it hard to exit to new areas. It is for all these reasons that the title of this book refers first to a decline in early democracy and then to the rise of modern democracy. Is early democracy an appropriate term? Those familiar with classical Greek thought may fear that my definition of early democracy is an overly broad one. The Greeks distinguished between rule by the one, the few, or the many, and for them the word demokratia was only associated with rule by the many, typically in a large assembly. Rule by the few was oligarchy, and it took place in the form of a council with limited participation. Even if governance under oligarchy had a collective air to it, this was not democracy as the Greeks would have understood it. Scholars have used the assembly versus council division to distinguish empirically between democracies and oligarchies. So why do I adopt a definition of early democracy that the Greeks would have seen as including both democracies and oligarchies? I do this because many human societies that at first blush appear to have had rule by the few also had participation by the many. In some of the early democracies that I will describe, a small number of individuals participated directly in governance, but they had to then face an assembly or council in the locality in which they resided. Among the Huron, only chiefs attended central councils, but they would face another council in their home village. In other societies, the few would ordinarily make decisions, but on other occasions there was much broader discussion and consultation. This was the case in the towns of the Mesopotamian kingdom of Mari. This phenomenon was also known in the Greek world, and it would come to be called a mixed constitution. Those who have catalogued the political regimes of Greek cities have found many examples of mixed constitutions, and they have also attested to the fact that it is often difficult to classify a polis as clearly oligarchic versus clearly democratic. Almost every Greek polis had some elements of these two regimes. Aristotle himself spoke of cities that mixed oligarchy and democracy. To me, all this sounds as if the barrier between oligarchy and democracy was a very porous one. For all of these reasons, it makes sense to adopt a broad definition of early democracy. As I do so, I will take care to emphasize the diversity within the group of early democracies. Some had popular participation that was very extensive, while in others this was more limited. The autocratic alternative. Autocracy was the alternative to early democracy. Since it is impossible in almost any society for someone to truly rule on their own, successful autocracy was aided by the construction of a state bureaucracy. Rather than rely on members of society to help provide information and collect revenue, autocrats created bureaucracies staffed with subordinates they themselves had selected and they themselves controlled. This was fundamentally different from relying on a council or assembly composed of members of society not subject to the ruler's whim. Bureaucrats could be sent out to assess what people were producing and how much they could be taxed, and they could also collect the taxes. They could also be used to enforce a system of conscription without having to give people political rights. Behind all this lay the reality of military force. Autocrats needed to hire and pay specialists in violence. Some of the autocracies I will consider were very efficient, and others much less so. But in all cases they were a clear alternative to early democracy. Opting for the autocratic alternative also depended on the mastery of techniques generally associated with civilization. The most important of these was having a system of writing so that bureaucrats could communicate across distances and over time. In Chapter 3, I will provide evidence of where writing came from, showing that there were both demand and supply elements to this story. Writing was more likely to emerge when societies had a need for it, such as when they grew storable crops that could be recorded. But there was also an important supply element, because inventing a system of writing from scratch is no easy task. Writing was more likely to be adopted by societies that found themselves near neighbors who had developed writing before them. Opting for the autocratic alternative depended not only on the presence of writing, but also on other elements of civilization. An understanding of geometry helped with surveying fields for tax purposes. An understanding of the soil allowed state officials to classify land according to how fertile it was and to levy differential tax rates on this basis. The paradox of civilization's advance was that it made autocracy function more effectively. The practice of intensive agriculture was another factor that helped facilitate the bureaucratic alternative by making the landscape more legible. The word intensive here refers to efforts to generate higher yields from the same amount of land through increased human effort and increased capital. If we believe that bureaucrats will generally have less information than local people about production, any process that makes production more legible to outsiders, to use the term favored by James Scott, will make it easier for bureaucrats to operate. Intensive agriculture often does this by reordering the landscape to make production more systematic and also often more compact. This was more feasible on some types of terrain than on others. But intensive agriculture did not depend only on the natural environment. It also depended on the advance of civilization in the form of new technologies for crop rotation, plowing, irrigation, and terracing. This brings us back to the paradox that the advance of civilization could further the cause of autocracy. Ultimately, many autocrats who exercised the bureaucratic alternative were able to do so not because they created a state bureaucracy, but because they inherited a bureaucracy from those who preceded them. Max Weber wrote that bureaucracy is among those social structures which are the hardest to destroy. In China and the Middle East, we will hear cases where a bureaucracy endured even in the face of massive dislocations. There may also be a corollary to Weber's claim: once a bureaucracy is destroyed, it is hard to rebuild one from scratch. This is the problem that the Carolingians and other rulers faced in Europe in the wake of Rome's fall, and it shows why Europe took a different trajectory of political development. Why Europe was different. The development of early democracy was hardly unique to Europe. The assemblies of classical Greece, the gatherings of the Germanic tribes, and the councils of medieval city-states all bear certain strong resemblances to collective governance as it occurred in other world regions. But Europe was different in several crucial ways. Unlike what happened in China and the Middle East, early democracy continued to survive and thrive in Europe rather than being fully supplanted by autocratic and bureaucratic rule. This is a first development we need to consider. Europeans were also different because they eventually succeeded in scaling up the practice of early democracy to societies covering large territories. Finally, early democracy in Europe then evolved through a series of steps into modern democracy. We need to ask how medieval Europeans developed a practice of political representation and how this eventually gave way to the selection of leaders by free elections with universal adult suffrage. The irony of early democracy in Europe is that it thrived and prospered precisely because European rulers, for a very long time, were remarkably weak. For more than a millennium after the fall of Rome, European rulers lacked the ability to assess what their people were producing and to levy substantial taxes based on this. The most striking way to illustrate European weakness is to show how little revenue they collected. Europeans would eventually develop strong systems of revenue collection, but it took them an awfully long time to do so. In medieval times, and for part of the early modern era, Chinese emperors and Muslim caliphs were able to extract much more of economic production than any European ruler, with the exception of small city-states. To see Europe's early weakness, consider the evidence in Figure 1.1 that shows estimates of state revenue as a share of total economic production in 4 societies: China under the Song dynasty in 1086 CE, Iraq under the Abbasid Caliphate in 850 CE, and England and France circa 1300 CE. Song emperors and Abbasid caliphs were able to extract upwards of 10 times the revenue relative to GDP that could be extracted by European rulers. These figures are for central taxation. The question of European local taxation, particularly for tithes that went to the church, will be discussed in Chapter 5, and it does not change my overall conclusion. One of the further lessons of Figure 1.1 is that if early democracy and autocracy were alternative routes of political development, they did not necessarily lead to the same outcome. Even after English monarchs had agreed to the Magna Carta, they were forced to settle with a vastly lower rate of taxation than were Chinese emperors or Muslim caliphs. For a very long time, Europe's rulers were in a weak position because they lacked state bureaucracies. They did not dispose of many of the technologies for making a bureaucracy work, and the Romans did not bequeath this institution to them. The consequence was that those who wanted a bureaucracy had to start from scratch. Contributing to all this was the fact that the form of agriculture practiced in Europe, which was extensive rather than intensive, made it more difficult for bureaucracy to operate. European states would eventually develop strong state bureaucracies, in large part due to external threats, but by the time this happened, democratic practices had become very firmly anchored, and they had also been scaled up to operate in large polities. With this sequence, bureaucracy did not substitute for democracy, as in the autocratic alternative. It instead became a complement. To see the fundamental weakness of medieval European states, take the case of Philip the Fair of France, who reigned from 1285 to 1314. He is often credited with creating a centralized royal administration, but even after his extensive efforts, Philip still had a permanent central bureaucracy of only a few dozen individuals, and he lacked permanent military force. Absent this, Philip's biographer, Joseph Strayer, argued that Philip had to attain his objectives through means other than the threat of force because he had little force on which to rely. Philip's reign would resemble a litany of negotiations with various local groups, in dispersed order, to obtain consent for and assistance with raising revenues. The final irony of Europe's political development is that the slow progress of science and civilization favored the survival of early democracy. To take one example, consider the effect of understanding the soil. From an early date, rulers in China and in the Middle East developed an understanding of how different types of soil contributed to agricultural production. Armed with this knowledge, they were in a better position to know how much they could tax their subjects, rather than having to enter a process of negotiation and compromise. In China, the legend known as the Tribute of Yu, or Yu Gong, recounts how Yu the Great, the first emperor of the Xia dynasty, surveyed each of his 9 provinces and established different tax rates according to the quality of the soil. Though the story of Yu is apocryphal, the reality of early Chinese understanding of the soil is not, and there is no European equivalent to the story of Yu the Great. The state arrived first in China. The course of Chinese political development resembles the European one stood on its head.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?